Testing, testing, one, two, three. We good? Perfect. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our eLotus webinar today. My name is Donna, and I will be your host and your moderator. For over 2 decades, eLotus has been your trusted source for TCM continuing education for acupuncturists. We offer the largest selection of online CEU courses with over 3,000 CE hours. If you are new to eLotus, remember to sign up today for an eLotus account to receive a free 1 CEU course as a welcome gift. This offer is valid for new accounts only. We're so excited to inform you that more acupuncture pictures are being updated on our eLotus core. If you haven't visited eLotus core yet, you can find it on our website on the second tab labeled core. You'll find Master Dong's acupuncture and TCM acupuncture points. Be sure to stop by after the webinar. One last update. Last Friday, we recently published a new article, Jin's 3-needle technique. In this article, you'll find the commonly used acupuncture point combinations for various conditions such as high cholesterol, liver spots, and even weight loss. With the listed traditional points on the article, we hope that you can use our eLotus core conjointly to optimize your learning experience. Okay, let's start today's webinar, Introduction to Maijing Pulse Diagnosis with Ivan Zavala. Ivan is a practitioner and professor of Chinese medicine. His interests lie in treating severe and complex disease with direct insight and guidance from the Chinese medical classics. Over the years, he has answered thousands of clinical and medical literature questions of practitioners from all around the world, becoming a specialist in the illumination of the canocopus, into practical application. Okay, let's go ahead and welcome Ivan Zavala. And Ivan, if you can do a quick sound check on your end.
Hello, 1, 2, 3. Can you all hear me?
Okay, sounds good. Go ahead and share your PowerPoint. I'll stop mine.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Lotus Institute for hosting me and being able to speak about something that I think that isn't taught often in regards to pulse diagnosis, and that is in regard to the pulse canon, so the Maijing. So thank you for your interest in learning a little bit more so about the Maijing, right? This this canonical text that is often we learn the name of it, but often the content is not explored, right? So again, my name is Ivan Zavala. Just call me Ivan. I teach at Chicago College of Oriental Medicine, and I practice in the heart of Chicago, Chinatown, right here. So anyways, to get to what you're here for, what is the Maijing? Maijing is a Western Jin Dynasty text, right? So after the Han Dynasty, appears the Jin Dynasty, composed approximately around the 3rd century. This text is accredited to the author, Wang Shehe, and is in total 10 scrolls with a total of 97 pian or chapters. It is a unique text in that it compiles information from a variety of sources, including the Neijing, the Nanjing, and other authors, such as famous doctors, such as Bianque, Zhang Zhongjing, Cang Gong, and Huatou. This is interesting because for medical authors like Bianque, we don't really have much post information in relationship to their lineage, right? So Bianque, of course, is called a person, but often he is also classified by historians as perhaps as a type of lineage. So when we say Bianque, we are maybe talking about Bianque as a person, right? But we might be also talking about Bianque as a school of thought. Same thing in the classics, there's also schools of thoughts. So when you read the Neijing, there are variety school of thoughts that create the foundation of the material and content. So every chapter has different schools of thought, and sometimes that's why you see contradiction. But the Maijing has variety of school of thoughts within the text, and that's why you'll also see some contradiction. But because the author is compiling the text from a variety of sources, then you're going to see that he is going to compile the text in a way that the material flows cohesively. So even though the thoughts and might be coming from different schools of thought, the underlying flow of the text has a certain order to it based on how Wang Shehe, the author of the Maijing, is compiling this text, right? So now, whether the actual contents belong to the aforementioned authors, Bianchi and Huatou, is a historical uncertainty. Nonetheless, it is of historical value to us as it's imparting pulse information from a school of thought that claimed to practice under the lineage of Huatou and the Bianchi lineages. Um, so yes. Now, who was this author Wang Shehe? Well, why we even care about Wang Shehe was because at age 32 he was selected as a Taiji, as an imperial physician by the Wei state, right? Because in the Jin dynasty, we have to remember that there were different kind of states, right, happening, because this is almost going into the state, into the time of the three kingdoms, right, the Sangguo. And so everything is kind of separated into different states, right? So, and then they begin to have war with each other and everything. But he was selected as an imperial physician, right? So, of course, him being an imperial physician, he has access to the imperial library. And so he's going to be able to look throughout this medical library they have and begin to look at the text and recompile for us and compile for us different sources. So in that way, he's very unique because he has access to texts that few other doctors at the time had, right? And not everybody was an imperial physician. So now some famous doctors like Liu Duzhou, which is a famous 20th century Shahanlan doctor, and Qing dynasty doctor Yu Jiaqi, she speculated he could be that Wang Shehe could have been Zhang Zhongjing's disciple, right? Um, Although this is not likely the case, this connection to Zhang Zhongjing canonical text is one that needs to remember. Remember that Wang Shehe, for those that remember, is that Wang Shehe is a credit to recompiling the Shahanlan for us. If not, it will have been lost to the stream of time. He also compiled other texts for us called the Jingwei Yuhan Jing, right? The Jingwei Yuhan Jing. And so Wang Shehe, because of Wang Shehe, we have texts that have been recompiled for us. If not, they will have been likely lost to decomposition, to erosion, right? So because of him, we actually have the Shahanlan, right? Of course, it was edited later on, but because of him, there was a copy that was kind of preserved, even the order, right? That's why the Shahanlan, you see it and you read it, there's the flow of it sometimes seems a little off, right? And some people blame because Wang Shehe, as he was recompiling this text, he might have gotten the order incorrect. And so there's a big criticism with him in the Ming Dynasty later on. But nonetheless, we're not going to be talking about this specifically. We're going to be talking about what I think is one of his greatest texts, and that is the Post-Classic. And it's my opinion, the Post-Canon is Wang Shehe's magnus opus. Because, I mean, we could say it is the actual text he kind of did compose, and it is one of the few post texts that has a Jing, right, a status, right? What I mean by Jing is what I mean by canon, or what we call classic, or what Buddhists call their sutras, right? So they'll use the word Jing. First, we have to see that this is classified as a Jing text. This is a special classification bestowed upon texts that have a special hierarchical signification, right? we have to ask ourselves, what is it about the Maijing, the post-canon, that deserves the label of a jing, a canon, a canonical text? So there's not something that can be answered in a short term, right, in a short way. But we do have to ask ourselves, why is this text called a post-canon? Even the Shanhan Lun is not the Shanhan Jing, right? It's the Shanhan Lun, the treatise. So he obviously felt that this composition of the post-classic um, deserved the title of a canon, right? Um, Now, why did Wang Shehe choose the method of what they call palpation of the four diagnostic methods, Zhen, to specialize in? Especially since palpation was classified by the Nanjing school as the lowest level of the diagnostic methods. So he's kind of revolving his whole discussion of writing in the method that is seen as the lowest by some other canonical texts. So that's an interesting inquiry in why is he so focused on this post um, when it's classified as the lower level of the diagnostic methods. Um, Even though nowadays we kind of hold it as the highest because it seems like the hardest, right? So sometimes because of its difficult, we say it's the highest, but it might be because of how we conceptualize the post. Well, to maybe answer part of the question, well, part of it is there was no specialized text focused exclusively on post studies, or they were scattered throughout different fragmented books that Wang Shehe recompiled. So in a certain way, his recompilation of the material is canonical in itself because before his post-classic, there was no specialization on the post as he did it. Dun, dun, dun. So so that's a little bit about the Wang Shehe and the post-canon. Now, I'm not going to necessarily bore you with the historical streamline of things, but I think a little bit of context is important always when we talk about Chinese medicine, because Chinese medicine always is dependent on context, right? So now post-lineages. As I said, even within this classical text, so within the Maijing, we already see different opinions on how to interpret the post. So the Maijing is not a cohesive synthesis that went out to look at as one system. You will be incorrect if you think the Maijing is one system. Instead, it is a text on various canon-based perspectives that open one's mind into the possibilities of post-diagnostics. Now, how far one can go with post depends on one's skills, one's exposure, one's memorization, and one's depth of perspectives. Looking at the post from one perspective will give you one possibility. Maijing, what Wang Shehe, in my opinion, tried to do is train your mind to look at the material, at the post holistically. So you're not bounded by one perspective. Thus, your diagnostic insight can truly penetrate continually into the dimensions of the post. One does not, now, I do want to say, one does not need to know every facet of post-diagnosis in the Maijing to come to a final diagnostic conclusion or make use of it. So just because the Maijing has different systems doesn't mean you need to know the whole Maijing in order to find value in it. The whole purpose of the Maijing is to expand your mind, not necessarily to 100% memorize everything. While there are certain aspects you need to memorize, like what is the definition of a pose, the interpretation of a pose is always going to be dependent on the context of how you're looking at it. Therefore, pose interpretation, right? In the clinical realm, one pose of a patient sometimes now is best interpreted through one system of thought. So even though there are different ways to look at the pose, different perspectives, at times they just like Chinese medicine diagnosis. Sometimes it's best to use five-phase perspective. Sometimes it's best to use a six-stage perspective. Sometimes a Wen-Bing perspective, right? Zhang Fu perspective, Yin Yang perspective. And so sometimes a slippery pose, for example, in the lung position is best looked from a Zhang Fu perspective, another time from a six-stage perspective. That will inform you best of what's happening with the patient. This, of course, as I said, this could be five-phase, the system of interpretation with six warps, or what they call six stages, Liujing, Zhang Fu, sometimes anatomical, right? A slippery pulse in the right chun could just be phlegm in the chest, for example, phlegm in the chest. Has nothing to do necessarily with the lung, right? Although phlegm in the chest might be affecting the lung, it might have nothing to do with right, a slippery pulse in the right chun might be a mass, right? I treat a breast cancer patient, and she always has the slippery pulse in the right chun, slippery rapid right chun pulse, and that's the metastatic breast cancer, right? It has nothing to do necessarily with the lung. It has to do with the chest, the chin positions of the chest. So that's an anatomical perspective. Disease level penetration, depending on how deep the illness has penetrated. One can also arrive at the clarity of diagnostic insight by being, so one can only arrive at the clarity of diagnostic insight by being fluid within rigidity, right? By what I mean is you have, I think a lot of people often have a misconnection with the pose. They don't have a confidence in the pose because they don't, or they look at the pose very subjectively because they don't have a systematic way to approach the pose. So that's what I mean by rigidity. You have to have a systematic way on how to take the pose. Every time you take the pose in the same way, right? That will make your pose taking skills less subjective, right? You basically take away the element of chaos, right? Every time you take a pose different positions, different ways, you're adding more chaos to the mix, therefore leading to more confusion, distortion in your perspective. And by what I mean by fluid within rigidity is even though you have now a systematic way you take the pose, interpret the pose perhaps, the way that you are looking at it from different perspectives is the fluidity, that you're never necessarily stuck by thinking something means this, something means that. While that may be useful and sometimes, that's the rigidity aspect, you have the fluidity to look at things and interpret it, things like a true diagnostician, right? Like a true diagnostician. Now, as Maijing does teach systematic thought processes, i.e. the rigidity part, and how to look at the system of thoughts and its expressions onto the post fluidly in different ways, in different mind expansive ways, right? That's the fluid aspect. So the fluidity aspect. Now, post system. Now, since the Maijing contains different teachings that have some relationship to each other based on the fictional correlation, right? So what I mean by that is that while there's different teachings within the Maijing, there is relationship to each other by how they've been defined previously. So when Wang Shehe defined to us what a scallion stalk pose is, what a large pose is, what a big pose is, a stirring pose, long pose, yada, 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 any of those poses that you know. Later on, when he mentioned those poses in later chapters, you will have to think, well, he already gave the definition of a long pose. So already there's going to be, he already defined for us, for example, slippery pose is a yang pose, a wiry pose is a yin pose, contrary to many thought who think it's a yang pose, wiry pose is a yin pose. So when it appears in another chapter saying this wiry pose in this position, then you already know based on his previous definitions that that you have to interpret it in some kind of yin way, right? And depending now on where you're feeling it, that will give you the different perspective. But it's still based on the definition he gave before. So it's not a random mishmash of different perspective. There's a definitional streamline that has a logic to it that gives a flow to the text. However, as I said, the interpretation of the definition can vary depending on the system of thought used to interpret it, right? A wiry pose based on Biantrist will be a little bit different how Zhang Junjing might be looking at it, might be different than how Hua To might be looking at it. But either way, the wiry pose is similar in definition, right? So it's not just a pure chaotic text, right? If not, it wouldn't be very pragmatic, right? Not only that, each system also has its own depth of intricacy. So every system has its own methodologies, right? And in practical terms, that means the segmentalization, the way you could segmentalize, what I mean is break the pose into different departments, compartments, will be different, right? Which will lead to a different focus, right? We all know that the pose can be broken into so many different ways. And part of this class is I'm going to try to show you how to actually look at it from the different ways. Even if you don't necessarily remember all these ways, remember even how the Maijing necessarily thinks about things. What is most important, and I think is the essence of the Maijing, is to truly expand your mind so you could literally, as you take the pose, you become like Wang Shehe. You become this post-diagnostician that every time you take the pose, you're gaining insight into the pose. Not necessarily just remembering lines from the Maijing, but as you remember and study the text, it becomes a living thing because pose is a living thing, right? Something that we investigate each time. So what I mean by the segmentalization of the pose is dimensions of the pose. What we extract from the pose is a measurement of how we are quantifying and qualifying the pose or the poses, right? When we speak about 5 phases or 6 chi dynamics, we're saying something very specific about the nature of reality and how we can use our understanding of the dynamics of universal law per the theorems of Chinese medicine and apply that into the image of the pose, right? So every time we say, well, this is, whenever we take the pose from a 5-phase perspective or what's called the 5 elements, Wu Xing, that is a very different perspective or way to look at the pose than its 6 chi dynamic, right? That is a very different way to look at the nature of reality. So whenever we take the pose, we are looking at the nature of reality because we have to remember that the pose becomes a manifestation of how the cosmos work, right? So the pose follows the physiology of the universe and the body follows the rhythm of the universe. That's why we could take the radial artery and necessarily predict how disease is manifesting, how disease is going to unfold, because we are predicting a certain aspect of universal law, which will be dictated by physiology of the body. And how that reveals to us, how the Tao reveals to us the mystery is through what we call the image, right? The pose image. Maishang, this idea of Maishang or pose image is crucial to understand as it makes the symbolism of the pose into a tangible manifestation. How is it that Chinese doctors were able to extract physiological information from the pose? It's through the derivative image in the pose, Maishang. And this image varies depending on the juxtaposition or perspective we implement into the pose. This is the dimensional image we get. So what kind of images we get? We get the dimension of depth. We get the dimension of dynamic. We get the dimension of type of illness. We get the dimension of physiological process, etc. And this happens through learning how to use the pulse in greater depth. If you don't have that wide bird's eye view when you interpret the pulse, then you won't only be able to get one aspect of this dimension. So the more you expand your mind, the more you have a connection to this Maijing perspectives, then the more you're able to look at the different dimensions of that pulse, and therefore the different dimensions of physiological reality. That's how some doctors are able to diagnose tumors, how some people are able to predict, oh, you have cysts here, or you're pregnant, right? Or your tumor is progressing, your tumor is regressing, that kind of thing. We could only do that by the Maishang, right? By understanding the Maishang in the context of that individual person. So the pose kind of trains your mind to think in both tangible and symbolic manifestation. It's kind of training your brain to think of things from a yin yang perspective. Think of things, what you're feeling physically, the tangible perspective, and also the symbolic aspect of what that image comes to mind. Because remember, when the pulse image hits your finger, it's hitting basically nerves in your fingertips, and that sensation, that nerve transmission goes into your brain, and your brains has to interpret that into kind of all the neurons have to make that connection, that synaptic connection, and an image comes out depending on what you've learned and everything, and that image will help guide your diagnosis. So it's very symbolic in that, yes, there's a tangible aspect, but there's a symbolic aspect because of how when you take the pose, how your brain is going to perceive the dimensions of the pose. So it's kind of like a left hemisphere, right hemisphere kind of thing, right? Now, the Liujing have had various interpretations throughout history. The six, because what I want to talk about specifically is about while there are various dimensions, different perspectives, I want to talk specifically about the 6 stages, the Liujing, or the 6 warps, my favorite translation of that, because it's kind of showing you how everything's interwoven, how the Liujing is interwoven. So now, since the Liujing have had various interpretation throughout history, but the term in the Maijing, the Liujing is likely linked to the 6 channels: Taiyang, Yangming, Xiaoyang, Taiyin, Shaoyin, Jueyin, right? So the channels as we know it, the channels and collaterals, Jingluo, right? So the Taiyang channel starts in your eyes, then it goes up your head, it goes into your back, buttock, down your leg, that's what I mean by channel, the currents of the flow of blood and qi, right? These 6 channels, or 12 really, right? If we actually divide them, right? Taiyang has 2 and stuff like that, and they all have 2. But these 6 channels, the Liujing, represent a conceptual framework on how to conceptualize a somatic expression of disease, right? How the body is going to express the physiology of disease. They are not limited to the continuum of disease penetration that is often taught in relationship to them, right? We often learn or conceptualize the Liujing in a limited way, right? We only learn, okay, you get cold damage, then it goes into Yangming. First it starts at Taiyang, then it goes to Yangming, then Xiaoyang, although some I disagree with that, right? Some say Taiyang, then Xiaoyang, then Yangming, right? But the ordinary is Taiyang, Yangming, Xiaoyang. And so they are saying, well, you get a cold, then it becomes internal heat, then you become qi deficient, qi stagnation, Xiaoyang, then you get yang deficient in your spleen, Taiyin, then you become yang deficient in your kidneys, so you start having a bunch of diarrhea, and then you literally have, because of diarrhea, you've lost a ton of blood, right? Worms begin to take over, and that's Drake, right? The common denominator, the common image of physiology we get of the 6 channels in school, right? Kind of limited, actually, way to look at the Liujing, because it is only a pathological viewpoint of the 6 channels. It does not encompass the full breadth that the Liujing represent. And the pulse is a way to access the breadth of the Liujing. So one aspect what the Liujing represents the six qi: cold, heat, dryness, damp, summer heat, wind. So that encompasses the the chi of heaven: cold, heat, dryness, damp, summer heat, wind. Right, the six chi. Those are heavenly manifestations. Right, they are not coming necessarily from the inside. They are coming from the external world. Right, that's why they are a universal force of a universal force of nature. And this six chi invariably are forces from the external environment, which then lead to what we call the Liu Yin, the six excesses. What I mean is the six chi are by themselves harmless. Wind is not a harmful thing. It is only when wind becomes an excess, something that becomes pathological, right? Dryness is not pathological. Heat is not pathological. They're just balancing forces of nature, right? Even inside your body, you have cold, heat, dryness, damp, summer heat, wind, but they are not necessarily pathological. They balance each other. You need some cold, right? You need some cold uh, in your lower reproductive system. We know that men, for example, if they sit in places that are too hot, that reduces their sperm motility, their sperm morphological um, uh, aspects of their sperm, right? So their jing is supposed to be cold. Uh, so there's always some balancing aspect of physiology. It's only when there is a distortion, right? So Liu Yin represents a distortion in balance, the six axis. There's only excessive external dryness when there's not enough dampness. There's only excessive heat when there's not enough cold to counterbalance it. This six qi ultimately lead to Waishang, right? External damage, right? That's when wind becomes the chief of the 100 illness, right? When there is not enough fire to balance wind, right? So that's the idea, right? Cold only becomes pathological when there's not enough heat to balance out the violent nature or the pestilent nature of cold. So external damage. The Shanghan school main priority is focused on external damage. But this external damage has to be seen through the vantage point of the six channels. As external damage has internal implications, as the body has to respond internally to the cascade of physiological shifts that happen with external damage. For example, while the Shanghan school is focused on external damage, the body still has to respond internally to the external damage. That's what I mean. For example, the body has to mobilize ministerial fire to deal with an external pathogen. If not, the illness can become latent. As per the Suen, right? Dongshan, Yuhan, right? In winter damage from cold, Chunbing, Wenbing, right? In spring, it will invariably become worm disease, right? So that idea is often sometimes interpreted as your body has to respond to ministerial, your body has to respond to cold through Mingmen. If you're Shaoyin, right, your kidney yang, if not, the cold is going to go deep and freeze your kidney, right? And eventually the pathogen will start to warm up and in the summer or in the spring become worm disease, right? Even COVID-19, for example, started kind of in the winter, and then it spread more so when things began to warm up, right? So we could say that is a Wenbing perspective, but it might have started from Shanghan, right? And invariably, COVID-19, C19 is often treated with Shanghan formulas, with a mix of Wenbing, because we understand that your body, your immune system, your ministerial fire is going to respond to external pathogens, and that is going to become a worm disease. But the root of it might be due to damage to Shanghan, meaning uh, damage by cold. That means damage to the function of your organs, damage to the function of your lung. And as your lungs become damaged, then your lungs get scarring, get blood stasis, your lungs 肺主 qi, your lungs govern qi, so it won't be able to govern qi. You get qi stagnation in your lungs, you get water in your lungs, you see. So first of all, you lose the function, and then it leads to a pathological distortion where your qi gets qi stagnation, lung cold, phlegm, and then that leads to basically some type of lung toxic heat, right? So it's a progression from Shanghan to basically worm disease, right? Your immune system, the cytokine storm that is responding to the cold pathogen, right? This mobilization of interior to the exterior is seen in the statement from this text, Huangdi Bashi Yi Nanjing Suan Chu Yu Jie Juan Yi, where it tells us yang qi is born in the chi and mobilized in the chun, right? So yang qi is born in the chi and mobilized in the chun. That means that you see the root of yang qi manifest in the kidney, but you see its expression in heaven, which the chun represents, right? You see its expression in the heart, right? So ultimately, you need to look at both. One is the root of yang, the chi, where it's born, but its manifestation is the chun, right? Because that's where the yang is trying to rise, kind of like the sun, right? It is trying to emanate its heat, its yang qi into the exterior, because that's what yang does. It rises like the sun, right? It comes from the horizon, right? From the depths, the chi, then it goes into the horizon, the guan, until it reaches the apex, the sky, the chun, right? So that's the image of how the yang is being born and rising. Now, it's important why we even care about pulse. Like, why do I even want to do pulse? I don't even like pulse, you might be thinking. Why is the pulse even important? I just like to ask questions, right? I mean, it's fine. But if you have that thought, now it's important to see that Maijing almost exclusively, right, uses the Chunko pulse diagnosis, so as a method of determining life and death, right? So we're able to diagnose, is the method of able to predict the prediction of the life and death of the 5 Zang and 6 Fu, right? And what I mean by Chunko is basically the radial artery, right? Because we have to understand that, first of all, you have to see that the pulse is seen as the method of predicting life and death, right? Because you have to remember that the pulse is an expression of the Shen, the heart governs the vessels. And if you understand that conception, then you understand that taking and reading that artery at the chun, at the sunko, right, we are basically accessing the life and potential death of the heart itself, right? And so that's the basis. Now, why I say that Maijing almost exclusively uses Chunko pulse diagnosis, by what I mean is I'm differentiated between, for example, in the Neijing, you have different pulse methods. You have this thing called Sambu Joho or Renyin Sunko. Renyin Sunko is when you take the pulse in the radial artery and compare it to the radial artery. Renyin, Yang, Sunko, the radial artery, Yin, right? And then there's Sambu Joho, where you take pulses in different aspects, the face, the wrist, right? Lung 9, heart 7, and of course, PC7, right? I think even the renowned Jimmy Chang uses now the pulse at heart 7 to predict like hormonal dictations in a woman, right? Hormonal permutations in a person, right? Because Xiao Yin, so it has to do with kind of Jing, right? But in the old days, you were able to diagnose through different places, right? Different pulsations. For example, if you want to predict if somebody is going to have a heart attack, or you might want to do a pulse at heart 7. If you want to predict how a person Jing is, you might want to do the pose at Taiji, kidney 3, right? Uh, that's the source point of the kidney, right? Each of them are kind of a different source points. You notice that? But the Maijing exclusively uses the chunko, that radial artery that we learn by the lung channel. Now, why did they even choose the chunko? Well, because first of all, even though we're predicting the heart, right, the heart's breath through yin and yang when the pulse expands, right, diastolic and systolic when it contracts, we are doing it through metal because there's the idea that the heart cannot be accessed directly, right? The heart cannot be accessed directly. So one way that we access the heart is through what it governs, right? And that's the lung. Remember, fire controls metal. Fire sends its mandate through metal, right? The heart through lung connection. So it's kind of, the lung is the minister, right? So the lung is the person that delivers the message throughout the entire kingdom, right? That's what we say, the heart governs yang kind of thing, right? Xiao Yin, fire, face. And then we say the lung governs qi. You see, the qi is kind of like the child of the yang, right? So we are assessing the child of the heart. Essentially, we are predicting what the heart is, the message the heart is relaying by understanding by talking to the messenger of the heart, because the heart doesn't want to be talked to necessarily directly. We are already talking to the heart directly by touching that vessel, right? Liujing post-diagnosis. Liujing post-diagnosis is mentioned. So this is the post method I want to showcase to you. The 6-channel post-diagnosis. The Liujing post-diagnosis is mentioned in the last volume of the Maijing, right? So volume 10. In the old days, these were seen as scrolls, right? The Zhuan, the scrolls. And in that volume, there are basically 4 chapters, right? There are 4 chapters. And these 4 chapters contain the Liujing post-diagnosis that will be presented today. It's important to mention this type of post-diagnosis is a 3-region post method, as we are dividing the post into Chung, Guan, and Chi, right? Because some post methods don't divide the post into Chung, Guan, and Chi, right? But this is a 3-region post method, right? Chung, Guan, and Chi. And that is actually part of the Sambu Joho segmentalization. Remember, Sambu Joho means Sambu 3 regions and 9 indications. I think that's how they often translate that. So there'll be 3 regions. So your head, poses in your head, there'll be 1, in your wrist, and in your feet. That's 3. Heaven, humanity, and earth, right? Heaven is head. Humanity is the pose at the wrist, and then the pose will be the earth pose will be in the feet, right? Kidney 3, lung 3, kidney 3, liver 3, and I think they use often Chongyang, stomach 42, right? And then there's 3 poses that we take in each site. But when we take the pose in one place, we are actually going to use the model. But now we are basically just using heaven is the Chun, right? Guan is humanity, and Chi is earth, right? So we are still using the method, and we are going to divide the pose into 3 depths. That's the 9, right? That's the 9. Because each position has 3 inside it, right? Superficial, middle, deep. And so what these authors did is, well, you don't have to take poses all over the body. That's so annoying, right? You could just do that method, that concept inside this artery, right? And already we are choosing the lung channel because, remember, we're saying heaven, humanity, earth. Humanity is the meeting place, the yin yang between heaven and earth. So the wrist has to be the place we could take the pose everywhere, because it is the connection between heaven and earth, right? And lung governs the qi, so it is the perfect channel to diagnose this heavenly and earth connections, and this heaven, this Tiandiren, this heaven, earth, humanity, pathological distortions. Now, before we go into the specifics of pose method, it must be noted that there's a connection between different pose image and a correlation to a specific Liujing, right? This is based on this text, the Huangdi Ba Shi Yi Nanjing Suan Tu Zhu Jie. They say floating is yang, right? And they say floating is a Xiaoyang pose. They say slippery is yang. Slippery is a Yangming pose. Long is yang. Long is a Taiyang pose. Deep is yin. Deep is a Shaoyin pose. Short is yin. Short is a Jueyin pose. Choppy is yin. Choppy is a Taiyin pose. So when they say floating is yang, they mean that has to do something with probably with wind, right? With wind. Shaoyang has to do with wind. So that's why it manifests as floating. So floating is not always Taiyang. It could be that there's some type of surging wind, right? And that's the Shaoyang aspect. Slippery is yang because it's slippery often is taught about a phlegm, but that's not always correct. Slippery just means there's an exuberant of qi and blood. That's why we see it as a pregnancy pose, right? Slippery can be yang ming, right? Pregnancy is a state, is basically yang ming taking place. That's why women get nauseous, gets vexation, right? Vomits during the first trimester. That is yang ming because there has to be yang ming closure. Yang ming has to gather. You have to nourish the fetus, the tai, right? Yang ming has to close, right? It's typical for women to also get constipation, for example. So that's an aspect of why slippery is yang ming. Long is yang, is taiyang, because taiyang is all about the high is yang, right? So there is so much yang, the greater yang, that the pose becomes long. It exceeds the chun or even the chur, right? Or even the chur. Some people say, well, you have a pose of the chur that extends past it, and they say that's a taiyang pose. So you have pain in your back, right? Pain in your neck. But the long pose of taiyang can also pass the chun, right? It could pass the chun. And that means there is basically head symptomatology. There could be a brain tumor. There could be brain bleeding. So if you see a chun pose that is passing past the chun, that means there might be head symptomatology, right? There's head symptomatology. That may be a taiyang pose. There might be stagnation of fluids in your brain. It's not as, when we say taiyang, we're not necessarily just saying taiyang disease, you have just a wind cold. I'm meaning you have disease in taiyang. Taiyang representing your head, for example, representing your brain, for example, representing, you might have meningitis, right? Just that head region is taiyang, right? So there's exuberant yang in the taiyang region. For example, in Dong acupuncture, we use the point zhengjin, right, at the Achilles tendon, right, by taiyang to treat brain tumors. So taiyang has this relationship to aspects in your brain, for example. So don't take taiyang as just a common cold. That would be incorrect. Deep is yin, deep is shaoyin, because shaoyin is about yang internalization, it's about winter. Short is yin, short is Jueyin pose, because short means there's it's opposite of taiyang. There's little blood, right? Little blood. There is little yin qi, right? There is, you've lost the ability to consolidate, right? That's about Jueyin. You've lost the ability to have resources. And choppy is taiyin, because choppy has to do not just with blood stasis, although it can mean blood stasis. It's also a type of blood deficiency, of a nutritive weakness, right? And taiyin is responsible for producing qi and blood, right? And if you don't have qi and blood, then you might have qi and blood stagnation. You might have blood stagnation, because if you don't produce enough blood, then your blood becomes static, right? So it's often a pose of taiyin is not producing enough qi and blood. So don't often think chopping blood stasis. In fact, blood stasis is often secondary to the blood deficiency when we think of Cha people. So a Maikou segmentalization. First, we have to understand that this division of poles into three regions, Chun, Guan, and Shi, are correlating to expressions of the neurological model of Tiandiren, right? Heaven, humanity, earth. Chun, heaven, Guan, humanity, Chi, earth. Tiandiren is about connection of heaven and earth and the expression of yin yang interconnected weaving a movement, the weaving a movement of yin and yang. The basis of the poles is engendered in yin yang, right? Mai Ben, Sheng Yu Yin Yang. Liujing is a yin yang model. Since Tiandiren is expressed through yin yang, right, which equates to 6, right? Tiandiren, so that's 3, right? 3 times 2 equals 6. So Liujing is just basically Tiandiren, heaven, earth, humanity, times 2, right? So Tiandiren manifesting in yin yang. Liujing is a model of yin yang, right? But 6 comes from Tiandiren, from 3 times 2, 3 times yin yang, right? Which equates to the myriad manifestation. That's why it can predict all types of diseases, because it's yin and yang expressing itself, the permutation of yin and yang expressing itself through heaven, earth, and humanity, through the realms of heaven and humanity. Now, this is the concept of Taiji, the poles. Yang is expressed in heaven, therefore it moves in the Chun. Yin is expressed in earth, thus expresses in the Chi. And Guan is the dividing realm between yin and yang. Think of the Guan like a dividing line in Taiji, you see, because we have yang rising on the left, yin descending on the right, and then there's the dividing, fluctuating ebb and flow of the middle line, right? That pose, the pose is nothing but an expression of yin and yang. Not only the positions, but the movement, the contracting yin and the expanding quality yang is yin and yang in motion. And the pause in between can be thought of as the Guan. So the Guan is not just a pose position. It's also when you take the pose and the breath between expanding and contraction, that pause, that can be seen as Guan, right? Because it's the intermediary gate. So the Guan represents the hinge from which yin and yang can pivot. And the pivot is between yin and yang. So that's why I always recommend for people when they take the pose to first locate the Taiji aspect. First locate the Guan, because from there we can pivot our fingers into Chun and Chi. Then we can locate heaven and earth. But first we have to enter the gate. First we have to locate the realm in between, and then we could find the realm of heaven and earth, right? So Guan is very important because it's basically the border between basically 2 dividing realms, right? It's kind of like the dividing line between our world and the underworld, the Chi, right? So as I say, yin yang can also represent an anatomical division. So a yang pose can be a disease in the head, chest, and diaphragm, but not just a yang position, but a yang pose, right? So, so you could have, for example, a yang pose, a rapid pose in the, right? A rapid pose is a yang pose, but then it could manifest in a yang position, in the Chun, right? So that is basically a yang pose, a yang quality manifesting in a yang position. So that would mean very different thing than a yang pose manifesting in a yin position, right? A rapid pose manifesting in the Chi is much more different than a rapid pose manifesting in the Chun, right? A yin pose represents disease in the umbilicus, back, and legs, right? So, so a rapid pose, floating rapid, can mean disease in the head, in the eyes, in the chest, in the diaphragm. A yin pose, like a deep And slow pulse can mean disease in the umbilicus, back, and legs. And an intermediary between pulse represents disease in the abdomen, ribs, and stomach cavity. That'll be kind of like a pulse that is kind of between floating and deep, right? So kind of in the mid-level, right? So that could be a mid-level pulse. I'm talking about depth or a position. The guan can be disease in the ribs, in the abdominal cavity, right? Of course, the pulse also signifies anatomical correspondence, right? As well as spatial correspondence, where the disease is spatially. It's here in your throat. It's here in this aspect of your chest. That's why some people even divide the chun position into 4 segments, for example, right? They divide the pulse into left and right. For example, the left aspect of the left chun, I'm talking about the heart pulse. The left aspect is basically the left part of your heart. And then the other part is your right aspect of your heart. But then you can also segmentalize it into up and down. So this part has to do with the mitral valve. This part has to do with the ventricles, right? With the atrium, all that kind of thing. Now, well, that is interesting ways to think about it, right? I don't necessarily use that, because if I use detect disease in the chun, I would treat just the whole heart itself. I don't necessarily need to know the heart. It's the left aspect of the heart, but it is maybe interesting to predict what aspect of the heart is diseased. Now, even though some people don't say with the lung, you could also do with the lung. The right chun, you could splice it in half and say, well, the medial aspect, right? The medial aspect of the right chun of your lung pulse, right, might be the medial the interior aspect of your lung, and then the more outer aspect of that might be the exterior aspect of your lung, right? The bronchioles, but the medial aspect might be the alveoli. Same thing with the you can also break it down into other segments. So the right aspect of that lung pulse can be the right aspect of your lung, and the left aspect of the lung pulse can be the left aspect of your lung, right? That's also with the heart pulse. The outside aspect of the chun pulse can be the outside aspect of your heart, the myocardium and all those kind of things. And then the inside aspect could be more the chambers, right? So that's another way that you could conceptualize and look at very specific anatomical correlations of yin and yang and predict how yin and yang is manifesting. So a rapid pulse in the left aspect, no, let's say a rapid pulse in the right and the exterior aspect of your lung pulse, in the lateral aspect, in the outside aspect of your lung pulse, in the right chun, that might be heat that is in the exterior aspect of your throat and lungs and your bronchi. But then when you see the rapid pulse start to go more in, more closer to the midline, closer to the pericardium, the heat is internalizing, right? The heat's in your alveoli. Now it's going deeper. It's going to cause more tissue damage into the parenchyma, that kind of idea, right? So that's the anatomical positions in yin and yang. Now we're talking about the physiological movement of chun and chi. The physiological movement of yin and yang is seen from chun to chi and chi to sun. Hence the statements of from chi to the sun to the chun, yang is engendered in yin, and from chun to chi, yin is engendered for yang. This summation is in the expressions of yang qi engenders in the chi and stirs in the chun, and yin qi engenders in the chun and steers in the chi. It's the same thing I was saying earlier about yang qi having a root in the kidney, but expressing outward into the chun, into heaven. And the opposite is true for the yin. It's actually born in the chun, but you see its manifestation in the chi. So sometimes when somebody is yin deficient, it might not be It might not be because of the essence or the jing, is because the chun is not engendering yin, and that lung lung yin, or that pericardial blood or heart blood, is not descending below, and therefore the kidneys, the jing, the liver blood become deficient. So sometimes that's the idea of the lung rain, of lung descending is qi, or the pericardial or the heart blood descending through the baomai, right, the uterus vessel, to nourish the reproductive organs. So that's that idea, right? That when we think about yang and yin deficiency, we can't just think about, oh, you're yang deficient because your chun pulse is weak, right? Your heart yang is weak. You have to say, well, if heart yang is weak, was it engendered by the kidney, right? If your kidney yin, and likewise, if kidney yin is deficient or liver blood is deficient, we have to say, well, did the lung descend into the kidney? Do the lungs have sufficient yin to engender kidney water? Remember, metal engenders water. And also heart governs blood, so you know that blood from the heart is going to be descending into the kidney, so the kidney can storage and nourish its essence, right? That's what the kidney tries to store, heart blood, so it can nourish itself. So Chun and Chur represent basically fire and water, or what we call Kan and Li, right? Kan and Li from the Yijing. Kan representing fire, Kan representing water, and Li representing fire, right? This is a physiological expression of movement of water and fire. Yin is producing the chuns, and Yang is producing the Chur. But where Yang shall express itself most lively is in the chuns, and where Yin shall express itself more lively is in the Chur, right? This is what leads to ordinarily weak and exuberant classification in men and women in regards to heart fire, Mingmen fire, kidney water, and heart blood. But what I mean is, in a man, the since we know that yang expresses itself more lively in the chuns, then we know the chuns should be more stronger. And since we know in women the yin pulses expresses itself more lively in the chur, the chur position should be stronger. So if a man, the chur positions are stronger than the chuns, and I have a prostate cancer patient that has that, right chur is always stronger. That's the metastatic activity in the prostate, right? Is usually kind of forceful at the mid-level, right? And due to damp and blood stasis. That is basically, okay, why is this person church position expressing itself stronger in a man, right? That is basically some type of disturbance already. But also, if you can also predict some type of personality. For example, if in a man the church positions is stronger, then you're going to see that he might be a little bit less masculine, right? Not in a bad way. This is not any judgmental aspect, right? It's actually sometimes best not to be that masculine, I think. But you might see that they're more feminine, right? They like to do more feminine things. You know, they might have, when they're earlier young, they might have wanted to play not sports, but maybe, I don't know, play with Barbies or something, right? And this doesn't have to do anything with gender. It just means sometimes their personality. Or sometimes in a woman, their chum positions are stronger, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with disease, right? It just means they have a very young nature. They're more masculine. They're more stubborn than some guys, right? They might be better sports than some guys, right? I know some girl who, when I was in the wrestling team, she was better than a lot of guys in wrestling. She's just or in karate, right? And so that kind of idea. So yin and yang are not necessarily fixated on genders, right? But there is still a normalcy. Men are usually more yang and women are more yin, but that is not always the case. And we have to ask ourselves, why isn't that the case? So in men, a strong chun and a weak chur is normal physiology. Not super weak either, because that's a weak kidney, right? just a weaker. What I mean by weak is weaker than a chun. And in woman, a weak chun and a strong chur is normal physiology. But as I said, uh, that can be uh, that can be contrary to the rule. As I said, a woman could have stronger churs and a weak chun, right? I mean, a woman can have stronger chuns and a weak chur. And in a normal woman, as I said, in a woman without disease, let's say she's young, 20, that might mean that she is just has a strong what's the word, obstinate nature, a strong stubborn nature, right? But in a woman that's more at age 50, a strong chun and a weak chur, right? Strong heart fire and a weak kidney water, that might mean that she's menopausal, that she might have insomnia, night sweats, vexation, right? Because now that kind of manifestation is not personality, it's related to some type of disease. Estrogen and progesterone have dwindled, right? So now there's a bunch of yin deficient fire in her heart. Her palms might be red. I see a lot of women with their palms are very red. That's some type of yin deficiency, right? And they also have scallion stock pulses, right? They have very their pulses are very wide and thick, right? That's the scallion stock. That's the yin deficiency. That's the yang expanding outward. Lastly, to grasp fully Liujing diagnosis, we have to understand the concept of the 9 divisions. We established that 3 is Tiandiren, and 6 representing the 6 channels is a yin yang expression. But 9, we understand that 3 is Tiandiren, 6 represents the 6 channels, the Liujing, but then we have this number 9, the 9 divisions, or what I call the 9 indications previously. But 9 represents how Tiandiren is quantified inside of itself, meaning Tiandiren within Tiandiren, which is a type of exponential notation by squaring the number. It's the yin and yang within yin and yang, right? Because how you arrive at 9 is 3 times 3. How you arrive at Liujing is 3 times 2, right? 3 times 2 is heaven or humanity times yin and yang, Liujing. And 9 is heaven earth humanity times heaven earth humanity, which equals 9. So this is where we quantify heaven and earth within heaven and earth. This has quite a number of variations, but this is important as it's illustrating how to divide the pulse and get a complete understanding of heaven and earth divisions in the body through the medium of the pulse using the blood vessel. As I said before, the blood vessel is an expression of the heart, of the blood, of the shin, that correlates to a vibration that has the signature of heaven. So that's what the pulsation is, right? The vibration of the signature of heaven, of the heart fire. And one model of this 9 division is depths, for example. For example, Chun, Guan, and Chi, that's 3. And then when we divide the pulse into 3 depths, superficial, medial, and deep, that is basically a 9 division pulse, right? But I'm going to introduce another one, a specific one today. So there's Tian heaven in the Chun, there's Tian heaven in so there's Tian heaven in the Chun, there's Tian heaven in the Guan, and there's Tian in the Chi. There's humanity in the Chun, Guan, and Chi, and there's earth within the Chun, Guan, and Chi. This idea of 3 regions and 9 indications was originally a pulsite method as seen in the Su in chapter 20. What I mean by this, Tian heaven in the Chun, in the Guan, and Chi, meaning that there is heaven influence in each one. There's humanity aspect in each one, and there's an earthly influence in each one, right? For example, when you read a superficial Guan pulse, let's say your Guan pulse is pounding superficially, that is basically liver going into the heaven. That's why you get liver yang rising into the head. So you get migraines, headaches, red eyes, sore throat, anger, don't talk to me, that kind of thing. um, that is basically liver fire expressing itself to heaven, and that's why it's found at the surface, right? So that is an example of that. um, or when a chur pulse is a heaven, we call that kidney yin deficiency. So, for example, the left chur, the kidney water, the kidney the pulse is a heaven, the surface, and it's floating and rapid or thin, right? Kidney yin deficiency. Then the person might have vexation, they might have night sweats, they have this temperature fluctuations. That's basically kidney expressing itself through heaven, right? So it's that idea. um, if, for example, um, to give more examples of this, humanity in the chun, that might be, for example, the middle depth of the heart pulse or the middle depth of the lung pulse. That might be that the middle depth is, for example, let's say tight or wiry tight, right? So that might be a person that has this constriction in the humanity aspect of the heart. That means that might be the yin level. That might be their emotional level. They might have this tightness. They always have oppression in their chest. They always have this inability to take a deep breath, right? They have oppression in their diaphragm, in their chest, right? In their blood, kind of in their yin level, in their blood level, right? So that's like the humanity aspect, the chun, right? Um, and then the earth aspect might be a deep pulse in the chun, a deep pulse in the lung. A deep pulse in the lung might be that you have lung disease, you might have some type of bronchitis, you might have some type of pneumonia, right? Uh, and that the pulse might be signifying that you have some type of phlegm in the lung, right? You have some type of phlegm within the earth aspect of the lung, the Jing aspect of the lung, right? Now, instead of segmentalizing Tiandi Ren all throughout the body, some medical authors focus on the radial artery exclusively. Wang Shehe even classified the Renyin Sunko, originally a carotid to radial artery pulse method of yin and yang, and made it into a pure radial artery method, right? He said, I want to take your pulse in your neck and in your artery, right? It's kind of like this is a method for the lazy people, right? I don't want to take your pulse here and then here. Besides, I mean, if I'm taking the pulse of an emperor in their neck, they might execute me. They might think I'm choking them, right? Um, but no, instead they say, well, left is Renyin, because left is Yang, and right is Chico, right? The mouth of Chi. Renyin means the meeting place of humanity, like Renyin, like stomach 9, and Chico means the mouth of Chi, right? So the right pulse is Chico, and the left is Renyin, right? Yang versus Yin. So the Tiandi Ren pulse methods, the pulse can be divided into 3 positions, as we commonly know. But within the 3 positions, we can also divide the artery into 3 segments, which isn't about depth, which I was saying, but from the outside aspect of the vessel to the middle aspect of the vessel to the inner aspect of the vessel, lateral, center to medial, right? So therefore, the lateral aspect of the chun represents the Tian of Tian, the heaven of heaven. The center aspect represents the Ren of Tian, the humanity of heaven. The medial aspect represents the earth of Tian, right? The the earth aspect of heaven. So when we divide the poles, the outer aspect is the heaven of heaven, the middle aspect is the humanity of heaven, and the inner aspect is the earth of heaven, right? That is basically telling us also a pathological progression. So the same thing with the guan. The guan represents the ren aspect, but the outside aspect of that guan is the tian of ren, is the tian of humanity. The center aspect represents the ren of ren, humanity of humanity, and the medial aspect represents the earth of ren, the uh, the earth of humanity. And the lateral aspect of the chur represents the tian of di, the humanity of earth. The center aspect represents the Ren of D, the humanity of heaven, and the medial aspect represents the earth of earth, right? Um, So that's the method that actually the Liujing actually talks about. This way to actually break down the artery into different ways, just moving your fingers basically laterally, center, and medially. That will tell you different aspects of physiology. And I'll show you how. And they give us examples. Um, this is a TND Ren variant. This isn't necessarily the one I'm sharing, but it is a variant seen throughout history, where they're dividing the pulse into the different um, sides, into different lateral, medial, inside aspects of the vessel. And this one is saying in the upper heaven division indicates foot xiaoyang to the head corner, right? So that's basically the lateral aspect. Upper humanity division, it's hand xiaoyang to the ears and eyes. The upper, so that idea, I don't necessarily want to go through all these because I'm not necessarily going to teach this, but this is just a historical model of different ways to conceptualize this variant and how people have interpreted, right? For example, the center humanity division. So in the middle, your guan, at the center aspect, that could represent your heart, right? So the heart is not always taking in the heart position. It can be, sometimes you could just diagnose heart disease straight at the guan. And that's basically, maybe you could think of that Xiaoyang disease that has afflicted the heart, right? Because even the Shanghai Lun says if you purge Xiaoyang disease, then it will lead to palpitations and fright and palpitations. You should never purge Xiaoyang disease, and that will lead to fright and palpitations. Xiaoyang disease, this wind that has afflicted the heart, right? And we know the Xiaoyang people often have this taciturnity, right? This emotional repression, right? This emotional depression, right? That, so Xiaoyang disease affect the heart. So we could make physiological correlation to all of this, right? The lower division of heaven indicates the liver, so that's basically the lateral, the inside aspect of the chun, right? And here we're not even talking about right chun, left chun. We're talking about just either chun, right? So it's not even dividing left and right. So the lower division of heaven, that might be the inside aspect of the liver. The inside aspect of chun might be the liver, right? So sometimes you could diagnose the liver by the chun, right? But that's just one historical model. So now this can have different interpretation, this model, and this can certainly be talking about depth, right? As they talk about lower, center, upper. So this could be talking about depth. As the pulse depth can also be divided into 9 depths, but I only showcase this to illustrate the concept of the fragmenting heaven earth humanity theory to understand its implications. So the last concept that needs to be understood is that the outside aspect of the vessel represents the exterior, and the medial inside aspect of the vessel represents the interior, the inner heart of the vessel, right? You could say that you could diagnose exterior conditions by the external aspect of the vessel, and you could diagnose more constitutional illnesses by the inside aspect of the vessel. So here's exterior and interior examples per the Suen. Again, you don't necessarily have to memorize this. I just want to introduce the principle, and then you don't necessarily even have to memorize all this, right? The most important thing is to grasp the principle in regards to this, and then memorize a little bit, but not necessarily the whole model. You just have to understand how the Maijing looks at things holistically. So this is actually from this kind of, if I remember, Suen, one of those post chapters from chapter 16 to 19, 16 to 20, somewhere around there. So here they say the left outside aspect of the left represents the kidney, the inner aspect represents the abdomen. The left guan outside represents the liver, and the inner aspect represents the diaphragm, right? The right guan outside represents the spleen, and the inner aspect represents the stomach cavity. So in this case that we're looking at it, they were almost looking as the outside aspect is the zang fu, is the zang, and the outside aspect and the inside aspect is more the anatomical aspect. So it's first like the disease first affects the zang, and then it affects the anatomical, uh, right? So it might be it first affects the function of the organ, then it affects the actual structure, right? Near the organ, right? It first affects the stomach before affecting the epigastrium, right? It affects first the intestines before it affects the whole mesentery, right? So that kind of idea. Now, I don't necessarily use this model, but it is interesting how they are looking at the outside aspect is the zang. Now, this might be because in the older days, the Neijing, for example, did not look at pulse from oh, this position is your long and large intestine. This is the heart and small intestine. If anything, that's a little bit later model. Suen is not necessarily interested in that. Suen is mostly interested when it comes to Susung Ko diagnosis or radio artery diagnosis, is diagnosis of the five zang. So five zang and the anatomical area by the five zang. That's what the Su Wen is more interested. So that will maybe explain why the zang are on the outside, because from the perspective of the Su Wen, they are basically what they're interested in. This is based on what we call accumulations G. Sorry, I didn't have time to translate it, but this is from the Jingwei Yalue, where they talk about how you could actually predict where tumors are at, or not, maybe it's hard to say these are fully tumors, but an accumulation, which nowadays you could maybe interpret as a tumor, but it's a type of mass, fibroid, cysts, right? Lipomas, right? Any type of oma, right? Sarcoidosis, for example, anything like a sarcoid or any type of lesion, right? It's a G, it's accumulation. And they say, oh, the method, Juji Dafa, the method of the great method of the G, of how to diagnose this G, is the pulse comes thin and attaches, it attaches close to the bone. This is what they call a G, right? Yeah. So if this pulse that's thin and attached to the bone is closed in the chun, then that is basically the G is in your chest. If it's slightly above the chun, then the G is basically in your throat. If it's on your guan, the G is basically on the side of your umbilicus. If it's above the guan, meaning between the chun and guan, then basically the G is below your heart, your epigastrium. If it's below the guan a little bit, the G is in your lower abdomen. And if it's between and if it's in the chur, that G is basically in your chi chong, which is basically stomach 30, right? Stomach 30. So pelvic region. And if it's, and then you could say if it's below the G, if it's below the chur, then you could say the accumulation is even below in your leg somewhere, right? Or in your testicle, somewhere around there. So that's the idea of diagnosing even accumulations. You see how you divided that pulse into different. So you divided it in the chun, guan, and chur, and then you divided it above the chun, below the chun, below the guan, and below the chur. So that is also looking at things from a Tian Yuan perspective, right? What I just hope to kind of instill is that whenever we talk about a pulse method, we are very clear about what kind of perspective we're looking at it. Because the more clear you are on the perspective you're looking at it, the more you understand that perspective, and the more, I think, the more closer or the more clearer your diagnosis is. Because if you juxtapose a bunch of perspectives, this person says this about the pulse, this person says this about the pulse, also read this in the pulse in this book, and you don't understand at least the perspective where it's coming from, not necessarily even memorize the whole quote or something. I'm just talking about the perspective of what how the context of that perspective, then then things become a mishmash. Things become confused, and then without clarity, then post-diagnosis becomes unclear, or diagnosis. Um, this is what I call the 9 Tao of the pulse, or what I call, this is a term that I've coined, although they might have said it somewhere else that I'm not aware of, as there's the Chinese medical literature treasure trove is huge, right? But I haven't seen it, so I'm going to say I coined it. But if you see it somewhere else, let me know. The 9 Tao of the pulse, Maijing Jiu Dao. The Maijing calls this the 9 divisions, right? Calls this 9 divisions, and I'm calling it as the 9 Taos. The Maijing doesn't say the 9 Taos. I'm saying it. So actually, it does call it the 9 Taos. Sorry. Oops. So they say in the Chun, Yin and Yang, Jiao Hui. Yin and Yang are kind of meeting, Jiao Hui. They are connecting and meeting, right? The nexus of Yin and Yang is in the Chun core. Within it, there is Zhongyou, Wubu. Within this, there's 5 regions. There's the front, there's the back, there's left and right, and everything that which it governs, right? Up and down, the middle, and this can be fun way, 修道. This can be segmentalized, can be broken down, divided into 9 Taos, into 9 paths, into 9 roads. Therefore, we call this the method of the Tao, right? So this is the method of the Tao. So why is this Tiandi Ren important? Because we're talking about the method of the Tao. We're not talking about the method of the, right? We're not talking about the method of humanity, right? We're talking about the greatest method of them all, the method of the Tao. And this is like from the post classic, if you are interested, I think Yang Shouzhong translated this author, and in it he has this little diaphragm that it's actually the only picture that he has in the book. That's why it kind of fascinated me. So here, if you could see it clearly, but also have it right there, and it's the way he's just dividing it is very interesting. So this is where I am basically getting the method, right? So don't think that I invented it per se. I'm just the one who's basically showcasing it and interpreting it for you. And the good thing is that I didn't just grab this method yesterday and teaching it to you. Now I've used this method, I don't know, probably like hundreds of times now, right? So, and always do it when I do a post-diagnosis, right? And sometimes I use it. So not like I always use it. So I'm not going to say I always use it, but the times that I do use it, I always find very interesting correlations to it, and even be able to predict the pathophysiology of something, right? For example, a case of severe panic attacks, I was able to understand through this method why the panic attacks were happening. There's other examples. Or the example of someone that cancer, why the cancer was kind of internalizing more, or why a person was getting like their abscess was manifesting. This is the kind of thing that this will actually showcase to you. This is again an historical example. Thanks to my friend Michael Brown for showing me this picture. But this actually comes from the Neijing, Sanbu, Zhen, Hotu. So left hand, right hand, and this is basically dividing the pulse into 3 jiaos: shang jiao, zhong jiao, xia jiao, upper jiao, middle jiao, lower jiao. And it's saying that the upper jiao is heaven portion, the middle jiao is the humanity portion, and the lower jiao is the earth division, right? but the pose can be divided into exterior, interior, exterior, interior, exterior, interior, and of course anatomical, right? Heart, gallbladder, all those kind of things, right? In your abdomen. Um, so first we'll talk about the first Tao. So we call the Tao of Heaven. So the Tao of Heaven, the outside of the front of the Chun, so the outside of the Chun, and pardon me if I didn't necessarily like make this the most clear. Sometimes I feel like wording this was a little uh it's so clear in Chinese, but when I try to put it in English, sometimes I feel like I didn't do that great of a job. Um, but hopefully I can explain it better. So the outside aspect of the front of the front, the Chun. So the lateral aspect of the Chun represents foot taya. So, and I also put it in order for you guys because in the book they have it kind of in this order that's kind of it's kind of weird. So they put, oh, this is the outside here, then there's the inside here of the guan. I'm like, why couldn't he just put it like in first the chun, you know? And so I put it in order for you guys. The outside of the front, the chun, the lateral aspect of the chun represents foot tayan. The middle aspect of the chun represents han xiao yin, the heart. In the and the inside aspect of the chun, the front, represents foot jue yin. Now, why this? This reveals to us a connection between bladder, heart, and liver that must be noted physiologically, as is how Taiyang physiology functions. This is a connection of Wei Qi, of wind. They say the heart, 心者, 生者本, 生者, 边业, the heart is the root of engenderment. It is the transformation of the Shen. 奇化 Saimin, it manifests, it blossoms in the face. 青虫 Sai, 血脉, it flourishes or it fills in the blood vessels. And Wei Yang Zhong Wei Taiyang, I mean Yang Zhong Zhi Taiyang, it is the Taiyang, it is the Taiyang within Yang. It is the greater it is the greater Yang within the Yang. So the heart is classified as the greatest Yang. The heart is called Taiyang, not to be confused with Taiyang bladder or Taiyang small intestine. When we classify the heart in terms of the Sang Fu, we can say the heart is Taiyang. So we can see that why for Taiyang, the outside aspect, needs to be fueled by the heart. There needs to be enough heart blood, right? They say it fills in the blood vessel. So the blood of the bladder needs to have the heart blood, right? That's why when we sweat a bladder condition, we use heart blood. This idea is explicitly told to us in the Shanhan Lun, where they literally told us, if you sweat this person incorrectly, then they might even be crossing their hands in their chest. 规矩干燥汤, right? 规矩 plus 干燥, because they become heart deficient. So Taiyang, whenever that's why, for example, Ma Huang led to diseases of the heart. But we use Ma Huang to release Taiyang. You see that connection? So that's why whenever we do find maybe a tight pulse there to sweat the Taiyang condition, right? I guess to sweat the person that has a tight pulse, right? Which is basically a cold damage pulse, right? As per the standard TCM pulse of it. We have to notice that does the heart have enough yang? And we could actually tell by just rolling your finger a little bit inside. Not fully inside, because there'll be the liver, but just a little bit inside. Now you can also press in inside there and to see if there's any strength, right? To see if the person can even handle you sweating them, or how much you should sweat them, because Taiyang can also be about too much sweat, right? Or like a 贵之汤, 中风. So that idea. So, and why it's connected to the liver, this just told us completely clear. Well, maybe clear to me. 变追因买 right? 并买征兵兵 in the chapter of Drayin, Drayin Zhongfeng, Drayin wind strike. When the poles wave when it's slightly floating, way it's on the verge of recovering. 不服, if it's not going to float, 微美 you, it's not going to recover. So this is the idea that for Taiyang to recover, you need wind, you need liver, right? That's why we use basically Guager methods to stimulate the liver, right? Fuxing Jue idea of having of the liver, right? Now the Fuxing Jue is now translated by Savin Wilms. So if you want to read that, and it tells us Guager, a twig, right, is like a twig, right, like a branch of a wood, right, helps stimulate the liver. So sometimes we need to basically look at the foot drain physiology to understand Taiyang physiology. Why even heart blood goes from the exterior to the from heart blood into the exterior is through basically drain, because drain is about the resurrection of the yang. It closes the heart blood so the heart blood can go upward into the exterior. And actually all Zhongfeng, all wind strike is actually affecting the liver somehow. Even wind strike in Taiyang is affecting the liver. It is affecting the flow of qi. It's affecting the flow of weight qi. It's affecting, remember, wind correlates to the liver, right? So it's affecting the relationship between the blood at the external and the blood in the interior, right? This is what the Tao of Heaven is telling us. The progression of blood from the exterior, Taiyang, into the blood into the interior, Zheyin, and also the Yang in between, which is the heart. So this is the Tao humanity. So that's the Tao heaven. Now, of course, I could always speak more about that, but I actually want to show you guys the whole model. So I'm just trying to showcase to you a little bit about the logic of why the pulses are in the ways they are, right? Why the exterior chun is bladder, why the inside chun is heart, and then the inside middle and the inside chun is liver. Okay, so I want to show you the logic of that, right? Of course, I also have to think sometimes, like, is this? So, but yes, I want to show the logic. So that's why I'm trying to showcase you, not just present it to you, because I mean, you could just read the book, but show you a little bit about the logic so you can understand the physiology. So what I'm trying to propose to you, that this model is talking to us about Liujing physiology. It is not just a random model why the liver is at the medial aspect of the chun. There's a reason, and it's clear to us as day when you read the Shanghalan. I remember Wang Shehe basically recompiled the Shanghalan for us. And while this method is not necessarily taught to us in the Shanghalan, we could say that it was influenced by the Shanghalan tradition. So maybe it's a model that he used last, because it might be one of the last post methods, but sometimes the last post method is kind of like the last thing he wants to emphasize to you. Like, oh, don't forget this, right? Sometimes people think the beginning thing is the most important, but actually sometimes the last things are the most important because they're the last thing you remember, right? Most people don't actually remember the beginning of a book. They remember the last part of a book, right? And so the Tao humanity, so this will be the Guan. So the center's exterior is Foot Yaming. So the lateral aspect is stomach, Foot Yaming. The directly in the center is Han Xinzhu, the heart governor, what some people call the pericardium, which I always think is not the best translation, but that's the translation that most people now have rendered, heart governor, because other things could be governing the heart, right? Maybe it's the heart tissue itself. Maybe what we call the heart in Chinese medicine is not actually the heart, right? It's just this, maybe it's the electricity of the heart, right? Might have nothing to do with the heart itself. And that's what I think, I think maybe Neil proposes, or something to that degree, that remember that the disease, Lingshu 71, this disease of guessing evils, this chapter on guessing evil, talk about disease cannot even invade the heart. What does that mean? Because obviously people get a bunch of heart attacks every year. It's like a big cause of death, probably number one or number two, I don't remember, right? It's up there with cancer. And so obviously this doesn't make any sense from a statistical standpoint. But the reason is because those people that are getting heart disease are actually heart attacks, myocardial infarction, all that, it's actually pericardial related. And what's actually Shen related, heart related, it might be the electricity, right? That's just an interpretation, but it's just a way to maybe conceptualize from a Western physiological standpoint that what does this mean, right? For disease to be in the pericardium and disease to be in the heart, right? Or not even be able to access into the heart. So directly in the center is the heart governor, which the pericardium for colloquial sake, right? And then the inside of the guan is basically foot tying, right? Foot tying the spleen. This connection is between the three is a nutritive connection. This is a connection of yin qi. Spleen and heart governor connection is very important. Stomach and pericardium connection per Sanfu Biatong theory that Yang Weijie, for example, has propagated, the one of the Dong disciples, right? Of course, he got the idea from people like Wu Qian, and who wrote the ancestral mirror, right? The Yi Song Jinjian, right? And then also the Tang Shou Hai, right? This one of my favorite doctors who was a Qing dynasty doctor who began to basically look at Western physiology through a Chinese medicine perspective. So if anyone ever wants to do that, you need to read Tang Shou Hai and you need to read Wang Qinren, because I mean they're the ones who kind of not necessarily perfected it, but did it without losing the essence of Chinese medicine. So anyways, they talk about this Sangfu Bietong theory kind of thing, but they have different name for it. And they show you the connection between kind of the stomach and pericardium, or we could say the spleen and the pericardium. That's why, for example, Gui Tang, which nourishes the spleen, can often have this fearful throbbing as a symptom, which is, I forget the Chinese name, fearful throbbing, but it's some type of chong, I think, some type of surge. That is a pericardial symptom because you're so blood deficient because your spleen is weak that you begin to basically have heart symptomatology, right? I'm treating a medical doctor who actually always has this symptomatology because medical school kind of taxes your spleen heart, right? And of course, anyone that went to Chinese medicine school, sometimes, even I myself developed anxiety when in Chinese medicine school. I never had anxiety because of the taxation of blood that required me to just integrate all this information into my head, right? No matter how well keen your brain is, it still requires you to sleep. It still requires to nourish yourself. If not, you will become blood deficient. And so this connection is between the three nutritive connections: foot yang, stomach, pericardium, and spleen. They are all about nutritive yin qi, right? So this is the theory of nutritive. So when we talk about the Tao humanity, we are talking about the nourishment, about gu qi, and it's this idea that gu qi is very important to nourish the heart, the pericardium. That's why, for example, we need stomach 36 for heart disease, right? 3 chun deep, right? Some people say 3 chun deep needle it, right? We enter almost 3 chun deep. We're entering almost the Jing level, because the 1 chun is the Wei level, the Shen level, right? Affect the tendons, the mid level, is the yin level, affect more the stomach, and the deep aspect is the heart of stomach 36, Susanli. And so it shows us even in acupuncture points that we can, that we must notate the relationship between stomach and between earth and fire, right? For example, pericardium 8 is also clear stomach fire, right? So it's very important to notate that. So this is a nutritive connection. So Yang disease is telling us that you had Yang disease is going to be affecting your pericardium. And then it's going to affect your Taiji. It's going to affect, that's why it leads to vexation, insomnia, delirium. Those are pericardium signs, right? And comatose almost, right? Yang. And then that's why Yang disease can kill you because it'll sap all your pericardium of blood, hot stomach. And then, of course, you deplete your Taiji. You deplete all your chi, so you become super tired. You deplete all your nutritive, right? So that is the idea. The Yang physiology depends on pericardial blood and also kind of relies on the nutritive of the spleen. And then the last Tao is the Earth Tao. So the Earth Tao is the Chi, obviously. The outside of the rear of the back, right, is foot Xiaoyang, lateral aspect. The center is hand Taiyin, and the inside is foot Xiaoyin, right? So repeat that. Outside lateral is foot Xiaoyang, inside is hand Taiyin, and then it's foot Xiaoyin. Basically gallbladder, lung, and then kidney inside. This connection represents the physiology of yin, right? Remember I talked about yin starts in the chun, right? It's engendered in the chun and steers in the chi. This actually is kind of talking a little bit about that. The production of essence, the movement of metal engendering water, the aspect of lung physiology of the purity downbearing, suzhang, and the communication between the upper source of water and the lower source of water, right? This is the idea from that, where the idea of lung being the upper source of water comes from this, from I think from this text, and basically they are saying that lung yin, heart, kidney yin relies on lung yin, right? You need metal to engender water. That's why most methods to strengthen kidney water have some metal component. Shen Qi have those sour herbs. Those sour herbs are to strengthen the autumn aspect of metal. Autumn is about collection. Sour is about collection, right? Cho autumn is about collection. Swan is about show, about absorption. And so whenever you are talking about kidney yin, you are basically going to be talking about some aspect of lung physiology. How lung, when it descends its chi, it's yang, right? When it descends that yang chi, then the kidney can begin to basically store. And when it can store, it can begin to strengthen its jing. It can strengthen its storage capacity. Remember, autumn to winter. There cannot be any winter without any good autumn. And of course, I said the connection between the upper source of water, lung, and the lower source of water, kidney, right? Sometimes people have black kidney issues. I mean, they have things like urinary retention, right? There's Lynn syndromes, right? This dysuria, or they have some urinary retention, more this long B, right, or bilong, where they can't even pee at all. Sometimes people catch a cold and they affect their ability to even urinate. Their urinate becomes lesser because if the lungs are stuck, then the bladder, the kidney is stuck. So when the lungs open, the kidneys can open, right? So that is that idea. So that's the idea of this formula called sanao tang, which is basically 3 I forget how they translate. It's 3-ingredient decoction or something like that. San ao. Basically, it's mahon tang minus guager, because you are not trying to actually cause a sweat, but you still need mahuang, xingren, gansao, and some people add zhegang, to try to open the lung and descend the the bladder, right? So it's the idea of opening the lid, right? Of opening the lid, concept. When you open the lid, the teapot, right? The water, the flow of water can descend, right? Um, so that's the lung and kidney relationship. Now, why foot xiao yang? Okay, so lung is the upper source of water, kidney is the lower source of water. Xiao yang is connected to the kidney and lung, as Xiaoyang is the intermediary stage between the upper and lower source of water. Ling Shu says, Xiaoyang Shu Shen, Shen Shang, Lian Fei, the Ben Shu chapter, which I think is chapter 2 of this one, where say Xiaoyang is connected to the kidney, and the kidney upward connects, upward links with the lungs, right? So Xiaoyang, by its connection to Sanjiao, to even gallbladder, right? That's why a lot of gallbladder physiology affects both the kidney and the lung, right? That's why with lung gallbladder physiology, Xiaoyang physiology, foot Xiaoyang physiology, you have dry throat, right? It's affecting your throat, your lungs. You get a bit of dryness. You might even have back pain. You start to become, actually, if you start to notice the Xiaoyang pulses, these people often have their chir pulses become weaker as you begin to flare into Xiaoyang, because the more you flare Xiaoyang fire, the more you become Yin Yang deficient, because you are basically taxing your yang qi. Because remember, Qini is about storage, about winter, and the more you go into Xiaoyang, spring, Xiaoyang is about spring, the more you're going from winter to spring. So the less you store, the weaker your Qini gets. And the more this Xiaoyang physiology flares, is going to go strike your lung, and then you get all this fire in your lungs, and you become kidney water deficient, so, or kidney yang deficient. So this is the idea. The Xiaoyang physiology is the intermediary stage between the upper and the lower as well. Lung representing upper, and kidney representing lower, and also the lungs represent the wei qi, and the kidney represents kind of the yuan qi, right? Or we could say the lungs represent the exterior, the kidney represents the interior, and the Xiaoyang is in between, right? So it's this connection of lung to kidney. We're always talking about this exterior interior connection, wei to jing, right? And that's why Xiaoyang pathologies can often affect the jing. It can lead to fibrocystic breast. It can lead to lymphatic cancers. It can lead to this diseases that affect your lymphatic systems, kidney cysts, right? Fibrocystic breast is obviously affecting the lung, right? So the chest, that idea. And anytime it affects something, affects the lymph, we're almost talking about it's affecting the jing, because whenever it's talking about the lymphatic constraint or lymphatic congestion, it's affecting the lymph fluids, which are kind of a thick fluid, a ye fluid. And that ye fluid kind of has more, is the fluid that has a close relationship to jing essence, right? It's almost like the filtration of blood, the filtration of almost essence, right? Now, I'm almost done, so bear with me. So now, whenever we take the pose, although the qualities of the pose illustrate to us the mechanism of yin and yang, and although I couldn't necessarily go through all the pose qualities with you, that'll be a forever class. They also illustrate to us potential symptoms that can pinpoint precise diagnosis. Thus, one can surmise symptomatology to the pose, right? So when you feel a rapid pulse in the deep right guan, That might be a person might have diverticulitis. They might have Crohn's disease, right? So you could even predict Western medicine diseases, right? If they have a deep pulse in the right guan, rapid pulse, right? Deep rapid, but also they have maybe even what the bird beaks pulse that Jimmy Chang talks about. They might have some polyps in their intestines, right? Polyps in their in their stomachs, right? It's just they might have. You might think of that as a G-mite pulse, a G-mite pulse. Remember that pulse that is deep to the bone, that accumulation pulse. So you might feel a deep rapid and an accumulation G-mite pulse. And the right one, that might be they might have some polyps, some type of uh, uh, the bulges, the sacs that happens in tuberculosis, right? I mentioned tuberculosis because I'm actually treating a few cases of that, so that comes fresh to mind. Now, one major pulse quality that is illustrated in this unique Liujing diagnosis is the quality of stirring, right? Dongmai. In the Ling Shu, we have Shidongbing, the diseases of the stirring vessel. These are diseases associated with Jingmai vessel sites that have pulsations. But the quality can also be distinctly found in the radial pulse, Chunko. A Chunko represents the totality of the 100 vessels. Chunko, Shou Taiyin, Feijing, right? Sunko belongs to Han Taiyin of the lung channel. The Fei Chao Baimai, the lung faces the 100 vessels, the lung meets the 100 vessels, and lung is the governor of qi. Lung vessel, lung channel, also qi yu zhongjiao, also arises from the middle jiao, and it is the place of where fa yuan, where qi and blood kind of emerge at the source, right? It's the place of fa yuan, the expression of the yuan, of the source of qi and blood, right? Chunko also is the dahui, the great meeting place of the vessels. So that's one of the reasons why Chunko is saying, well, I don't need to necessarily touch all these vessels, find all these pulsations. I could find all these pulsations in here, right? So that's another argument of these authors. Now, do I 100% agree with this? Because I sometimes use those other methods, but I treat mostly by pulse. So I'm not necessarily just here teaching you about pulse without actually using the pulse. I mostly treat by pulse, herbs and acupuncture. Even when I've done Tuina, stuff like that, I also touch the pulse. Before I do a Tuina, I'm not necessarily doing a whole pulse diagnosis, but I need to see this person's general qi and blood, because that will dictate to me how strong or how weak. Even if they need strong pressure, well, if you have a weak pulse like that, that might be you have a lot of pain, but if I do a lot of strength, a lot of strong, break all those adhesions, you might feel worse after all, right? So in every modality you need, in every modality you do, pulse governs in a certain way, because it tells you how much to do something, where to do something, at what velocity, at what strength, yada yada. So basically, these last 3 slides are about if you feel a pulse, one of these pulses, you know what, you could predict the symptoms. Bitter headache, facial redness, right? That is one of the symptoms of Taiyang, right? So facial redness can be even things like constrained yang, rosacea. You could maybe, oh, sorry, this is for Yami, pardon me. Skipped for Taiyang. So headache, nape, and waist pain is for Taiyang. And when that stirs, you might suffer from headache, nape, and waist pain. So you just find a pulse in one of those 3, in the exterior aspect of the vessel. So while the Maijing tells you about all 3 aspects, I'm only going to be talking to you about the exterior aspect of the vessel, the external aspect of the Chongguan and Chi, as so as not to basically fill you with inundate you with information. As I realized, this dimensional understanding of the pulse sometimes can be overwhelming in certain ways. So little by little, right? So foot Taiyang pulse, if it's stirring, so at the lateral aspect of the chun, if you feel a pulse stirring, then you might feel that might be other way. That might be a rapid pulse. That might be a slippery pulse, something like that. If you feel it stirring or just floating and just kind of surging a little bit, that might be the person suffering from headache, neck pain, back pain, right? Actually, yesterday I had this pulse and I was suffering a little bit with a little bit of head distension, headache, right? After a long taxing week of work, right? And I just did a Taiyang treatment and felt better. So, and I had that pulse, right? The exterior aspect of the left of the chun, right? Of the chun. Um, and so the person might have the pain in their body, right? In their back. They say if the pulse is floating, that is wind, because wind causes pulse to float, because usually due to some type of blood vacuity, kind of like a boat, kind of floating on water, right? If it's kind of empty, then it begins to kind of float, right? It's due if there's, because the more blood you have, the more things sink. So wind causes some form of blood vacuity, therefore the pulse floats. Taiyang essentially is about blood physiology, as we talked about, right? Affecting Jayin, affecting the liver. That's why there's Baishao and Guizhitan, right? Because there is some liver blood deficiency. Choppy is cold and heat, right? So if you feel choppy pulse, is the change between cold and heat, right? Because there's choppy, remember, is not just blood stasis, right? It's also this idea of nutritive damage, is this idea of blood becoming sluggish. Yes, is this idea of when blood becomes sluggish, then your body temperature can regulate, right? Because blood is not moving well, right? Blood stasis is not just internal pain, stabbing pain, masses. It's also that your blood temperature can regulate due to some type of yin disharmony. Tight is large food. Taiyang, also remember, could be related to the small intestine. Taiyang physiology, the bladder channel that affects the small intestine. You have so much external cold that your small intestine becomes cold, right? Dizziness, stiffness in the spine. That's pretty much explainable. Taiyang affecting the dumai. In males, there's yin external dampness, and in women, inhibited menstruation. Lower abdominal pain that extends to men with general pain. This is due to a closed uterus. Again, this is showing you the Taiyang physiology can affect your reproductive organs. It can affect your bladder, right? That's why sometimes people use Mahuang formulas for amenorrhea, for no bleeding, right? Often people sometimes use Mahuang formulas to open up the bladder, as I said, to open up menstruation, and even actually cause a person to stimulate a man's reproductive organs in erectile dysfunction, because Mahuang is actually a stimulant. It stimulates the heart, so it can actually affect for Taiyang, right? It can actually affect your yang. It can affect your brain, right? It gives you more energy. Not necessarily. So Mahuang can actually be even some people use it to tonify the kidneys if you know how to use Mahuang correctly, if you know how to use the stimulant correctly. If you don't need to use futsa, sometimes you could use Mahuang. Floating is wind, choppy is cold blood, right? So already we talked about floating being wind. Wind is kind of weighty, blowing in your exterior. Choppy is cold blood. Again, the idea of blood not moving well, right? Your body not regulating itself, so it leads to this differentiation of cold and heat, cold blood. Slippery is taxation heat. That is the idea of if you feel a slippery pulse at the lateral chun, that means that your body is actually manifesting fever because you've taxed yourself, right? So you sometimes have fever because you've taxed yourself. You've done so much work, Laura, that you manifest fever, right? You have some yang floating. Fodya mean bitter headache, facial redness, main symptoms. It pulses faint and slippery. Person suffers with difficult defecation, intestinal rumbling, inability to eat, the lower leg B. Faint and slippery means actually the faintness doesn't mean there is yang deficiency per se. It just means the yang has internalized and not manifested, because yang is kind of basically internalized in. And so because of the internal heat. So sometimes internal heat, remember, consumes qi, consumes yang, and yang can come outward. So the pulse feels faint, but you feel the slippery. So the slippery is the heat, and the faint is that the yang can't emerge. So person suffers with difficult defecation, intestinal rumbling, inability to eat on lower leg B. In fact, we could say that actually the heat has consumed some of the qi and yang. Remember, leg B already means the legs become kind of have pain, so they're actually due to dryness, and that might lead to Wei syndrome, right? To atrophy because dryness, because as dryness, as you get this yang dryness, all this, you might actually start to weaken your yang. Right? Yang mean yang brightness, right? So you see all this brightness at the surface, but remember, at below the bright, at the other side of the brightness is the darkness setting in, right? So whenever something's very bright, know that below the brightness there is darkness setting in, and that's the yang deficiency. It poses floating, faint, and slippery. There's difficult defecation, tendency to chief illness. Floating is the exterior manifestation. Faint is the yang becoming weak, and the slippery is the heat exuberance. That's the difficult defecation, tendency to cheerfulness. Yang is stuck. That's why it's faint, right? Yang is stuck. That's why it can't move. So you get cheerfulness. Slippery is room. That means that indeed yang ming can be about damp, right? Or just any type of yin obstruction in yang ming. Things are not moving through your bowels correctly. Yang ming is about drying out your intestines. If choppy, there's somnolence, intestinal rumblings with inability to eat. Foot B. Again, that is basically, remember, foot yang ming is about the it's about qi and blood, right? It's the channel full of qi and blood. So if it's choppy, that means qi and blood is not moving correctly, or there's nutritive damage. And so you might get somnolent, you can't sleep because you get stomach yin deficient or something to that degree. And you get intestinal rumbling, inability to eat, foot B, because again, dryness and weakness is setting in. And stagnation as well, right? Stagnation of yang ming basically leads to dryness, and that leads to basically qi deficiency, yang deficiency. So remember, that's a progress of foot yang ming. First, yang gets stuck, leads to stagnation, dryness, and qi deficiency later on. Foot Xiaoyang, the last one. Thanks for bearing with me. Person suffers back, spine, thigh, limb, and joint pain. So whenever a person has exterior pain, don't think, oh, just foot taiyang, bladder manifestation. Actually, Xiaoyang can have all type of symptomatology in the exterior. And in fact, actually the lung, I think chapter 22 of the Su Wen tells us when you have lung disease, you have pain in your coccyx, in your hip, in your lower legs, in your calves, in your thighs, in your foot. And remember that connection between foot Xiaoyang and the lung, right? So when you have this exterior manifestation of Xiaoyang, then you go have pain all over your body, because Xiaoyang is about this wind, remember? So these people even talk about like things like fibromyalgia. You might be located in at the chair position. There's people that have this chronic pain. This could be like foot Xiaoyang can have chronic pain, right? People that have exterior pain, but it's more chronic than a Taiyang. It's more of a Xiaoyang, right? Floating, again, is qi choppiness, inhibited qi stagnation at the surface. They say choppy is wind and blood disease. Emergent pulse is twisted cramps, right? Or twisted sinew cramps. And a wiry pulse is taxation. We often think of Xiaoyang pulse as just a wiry pulse, but a Xiaoyang pulse can have a floating quality, can have a choppy quality, can have an emergent quality, and they can have a wiry quality. Wiry is taxation, because whenever you wiry quality is actually associated with yin in the Maijing, and when you have that qi stagnation, the qi gets stagnant, right? Because actually you were deficient in yang, right? You were deficient in yang qi. Remember, yang qi gives birth to wood, right? So if wood can't mobilize, it might be the water might not actually be springing forth and nourishing and mobilizing wood, right? That's why we have the Xiaoyang correlation. Xiaoyang is lateral, and then in the medial is the foot Xiaoyang kidney, right? Okay, thank you. The question is, what book do I use? Again, the Maijing post that I just talked about, this Maijing book. I read it in Chinese myself, but I actually use this book too. I think it's a good translation. Yang Zhong, translated by Blue Poppy. Um, okay. Well, I'm done. Can you clarify how to move the finger from the outside closer to the lung or to the center, move the latter? So the way you actually move your finger through the artery is, I mean, it's kind of hard to showcase it myself, but when you put your fingers, I usually do the post diagnosis, the hand straight, right? And when I do that, I I first go from the outside aspect of the vessel. So I first locate the full dimension of the artery, and then I basically found the lateral aspect of the artery where I can still feel pulsation, but I'm not at the center uh, vector of the pulsation. I'm at the it's kind of like if you look at the aspect of the if you look at the vessel as kind of like a cave, right? You are basically um looking outside the cave. So with the when you look at the lateral aspect of the vessel, you are looking the outside of the vessel. You're kind of just feeling looking outside the cave. You're not going into the full nexus of the artery. You are kind of just touching the exterior boundary, the frontier. It's kind of like when you sometimes do massage, for example. You don't just go deep on a person. You first do a gentle, like I'm here first, right? A gentle kind of not necessarily gentle, but uh, a present touch, like before you start doing anything. And it's kind of the same thing that before you go into the nexus of the artery, you're at the boundary of the vessel wall, right? So you're at the outer aspect of the vessel wall, putting your fingers. You don't necessarily even need to uh, use a specific aspect of. I mean, I always use like the my finger pad, not the fingertip, and not the by the joint, where I have more sensitivity. And I kind of just always first I find the Taiji, find the guan, then locate my other fingers, and then I kind of roll across the artery laterally, where I could still feel the vessel, but not the main aspect of the vessel, not the center aspect of the vessel, but the almost like the vessel wall as it starts to kind of go into the vessel, right? So that would be the way I will explain that. Uh, okay. Um, thank you. um, so, was,
Thank you, Ivan, for a great class today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's presentation. Today's webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our TCM Wisdom Tube as well as our YouTube tomorrow afternoon. That's it for today, everyone. Thank you so much. And we will see you at our next webinar. Bye.
thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Lotus. Bye.
Thank you.